Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Öztürk, and on behalf of the IT Learning Network Project, I would like to welcome you all to our fourth webinar session. So following the first tradition, like the tradition in our first webinar, I would like to just say that feel free to chat, like to write in the chat box about your cities, your hometowns, so we will be in touch. So first of all, before we start, I would like to hand over to Dr. Solmaz, our project coordinator, for his opening remarks.
Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to our session to our fourth webinar in the project. And as you know, Virtual Professional Learning Network series are conducted with the support from Regional English Language Office in Turkey. US Embassy support has been crucial in this. And we have so far we have organized 4 webinars. This is the 4th one. In the first one, as you remember, we had Harry Potter themed webinar. And in the second one, we explored digital gaming and digital web tools and how we can use it in language teaching class. And then last month, we had virtual reality and how we can use it for English language teaching purposes. And today and tonight, we have another literary gateways to English language teaching and learning perspectives, and we will learn about how we can use them. And we also have a couple of ideas and tips from our speakers who are from United States and also our really own country, Turkey. So thank you for joining us today and look forward to making the most of the process.
And thank you very much. And I can see that the cities are like Denizli, Çanakkale, Elazığ, Istanbul, Adana. So we are all really looking forward to our webinar today. But before we start, I would be very happy to hand over to our big supporter, Roger Cohen from the Regional English Language Office in Ankara. So Roger, it's great to have you tonight. So if you have some announcements for this year, before we start the new year, we are ready to hear from you.
Thank you so much. And it is such a great honor and pleasure and privilege to be with all of you. I want to thank the Virtual Professional Learning Network, Dr. Osman, and all of his team for doing such an amazing job. I am Roger Cohen. I am the Regional English Language Officer at the US Embassy in Ankara, Turkey. And this is one of the projects that we support. And we support all different kinds of programs and projects and courses and grants, either face-to-face or online, all over Turkey. So we would be absolutely delighted to be in touch with all of you. And we would be very happy to come and visit you. And we're really looking forward to having more people participate in our programs like this one. This is the 4th webinar in the series. And so far, probably, I would say, Özge, we've had more than 1,000 participants total, probably. I think it's just absolutely amazing. And you see on the screen, our website is at the bottom with our email. And at the, I'll say after this webinar, I'm going to get everyone's email address. And our office, the Regional English Language Office, will send all of you our monthly newsletter. It's filled with all different kinds of programs and courses and opportunities that are all free. And as the new year approaches, I would love it if everyone made a New Year's resolution, and that is to participate in one of our awesome programs. And I'd be very delighted to see all of you. So once again, I want to thank the team for really doing an incredible job. And we have something really exciting planned for this evening, and I hope you participate in the other upcoming webinars in the series. The team has really done a great job. Thank you so much. Our office will be in touch with all of you.
Thank you very much for your kind words on behalf of the team. And it is great to have you tonight with us, Roger. So I would like to start the webinar with our first speaker, as we are all looking forward to our first presentation. So today or tonight, let's say our first speaker is Dr. Hatice Okyar. And Hatice Okyar received her bachelor's degree in English language teaching from Dicle University. She holds a master's degree in ELT from Necmettin Erbakan University and a PhD in ELT from Gazi University. She currently works as an assistant professor at Necmettin Erbakan University, School of Foreign Languages, Konya, Turkey. Her research interests include foreign language education, language teaching methodology, literature and language teaching, language learning strategies, and effective factors in second language acquisition. So just a brief reminder before we start, there will be a bigger Q&A session at the end of the second presentation. So feel free to write your questions in the Q&A part. So Dr. Okyar, the stage is yours. We are really looking forward to it.
Özge Hocam, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my presentation. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this meeting for inviting me here today. I am very happy to be part of this project, this event. Thank you. Let me share my screen with you right now. Can you see?
Yes, everything seems fine.
Okay. As you can see on the screen, our topic today is literature and English language teaching. First of all, I'd like to give you a brief outline of my presentation. I will focus on 5 main issues, and I will start with the definition of literature, and then we will look at the reasons for using literature in ESL classes. Then I will give information about some literary genres, pre-while and post-reading stages. And finally, I will touch on some important points about selection of literary texts. Okay, what is literature? Here we see the dictionary definition of literature. Oxford Learner's Dictionary defines literature as pieces of writing that are valued as works of art, especially novels, plays, and poems. That is to say, literature in its broadest sense is a written work of art, and it is classified into different types of different literary types, such as drama, poetry, and prose. And many researchers believe that we can use literature as an effective resource. Literature can be used as an effective resource in second and foreign language classrooms. And this leads us to an important question. Why use literature in ESL, EFL classes? What may be the reasons? Let's look at them one by one. First, literary texts are authentic materials because unlike most of the reading texts found in course books, they include examples of more natural, more realistic language. That is to say, they provide students with high quality language input, and this makes reading more meaningful. And literary texts are motivating and engaging because they include universal themes which are relevant to learners' lives, such as friendship, longing, pride, fear, heartbreak, and so on. And the next one is literary texts increase cultural awareness. As we all know, language and culture are strongly connected, right? And literature is one of the best ways to get to know a culture because literary works depict the lives of people in the target culture. I mean, how they live, how they behave, how they react to events, and etc. And they help learners develop a sense of respect and tolerance towards cultural diversity. And the next one is literary texts can improve higher order thinking skills. They encourage learners to use their imagination. Through literature, they can see how language is used in a creative way, and this helps them develop the ability to use language creatively. For instance, they can create their own poems, they can create their own posters related to text they read. And as for critical thinking, learners can ask why and how questions about the text they read. They can draw inferences from the text. Activities such as having students retell stories from the perspective of other characters in the text, or asking students thought-provoking questions like, what would you do if you were the main character in the story, can improve students' ability to look at things from more than one perspective and foster their higher order thinking skills. And next one is literary text can foster personal development, because while reading literary works, students can become both intellectually and emotionally involved in what they read. And they can express their thoughts, feelings, and about the text, and they can relate their experiences to the text. And the last reason is literary text can improve language skills. As for writing skill, learners can see different forms and functions of language in various literary texts, right? And written language. And this contributes to the development of their writing skill. Many writing activities can be used with literary works. For instance, changing the setting and the time of a story and rewriting it, or changing the ending of a story and creating a new one. And for instance, if the story has a happy ending, they can change it into a sad or surprising ending, okay? And as for speaking skill, literary text encourages students to do interaction, because learners can discuss and share their ideas and feelings with each other. And activities like role plays can improve students' speaking fluency and develop their pragmatic competence. That is to say, they can learn the appropriate language used in specific contexts. And listening, nowadays, thanks to technology, it is possible to reach audio versions of many literary texts. Stories, poems, all literary texts can be supplemented by audio recordings, right? And this provides learners with high quality language input and improves their listening skills. And the last one is reading skill. Literary texts promote active reading and improve high-level complex reading skills, such as predicting, connecting, questioning, clarifying, and evaluating. Okay, let's go on with literary genres. And as we all know, genre is a specific kind of literature. And here I will briefly mention the 4 commonly used literary genres in ELT classrooms. Let's start with short stories. Before going into detail, I want to share a famous quote from Ursula K. Le Guin. She says, "There have been great societies that didn't use the wheel, but there have been no societies that didn't tell stories." We all grew up listening to short stories, right? And therefore, we are all familiar with them. And there are many different types of short stories like folk tales, fairy tales, and fables. A short story generally has a single and simple plot, and it usually deals with a few characters, and it usually covers a short period of time. And therefore, they tend to be less complex and shorter than novels, and they can be read within a brief span of time. So they are easy and practical to use in language classes. On the right, you can see some famous short story writers from O. Henry Orwell to James Joyce. You can have a look at their stories. And also, your dictionary.com provides a list of children's tales and adult short stories. You can have a look at them. You can check their content, and you can check their level and choose the suitable ones for your students. You can see the link below. And here, British Council Learn English Kids website offers examples of short stories. For instance, children's fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood and fables like The Lion and the Mouse from Aesop. These stories are accompanied by pre, while, and post-reading stages. You can find a variety of activities related to stories like word matching games, reordering sentences, drawing, comprehension questions, and so on. And let's go on with novels. A novel is long written story about imaginary characters and events. Here you see the front cover of some popular novels, The Old Man and Sea from Hemingway, Of Mice and Men from John Steinbeck, and Harry Potter from J.K. Rowling. Novels are usually longer and have more characters and a more complex plot than short stories. While reading novels, students can see how advanced vocabulary, how advanced grammar can be used in a meaningful reading context. And sometimes the process of choosing the right novel can be difficult. And Loyola University ESL program offers a list of book recommendations. I added the link here, and let me show you the list. Here, as you see, the books are categorized in 3 ways: from easy to easy, and moderate difficulty, and from moderate to challenging. And under each category, you can see examples of different literary genres like novels, short stories, fiction, non-fiction, and so on. Okay, you can have a look at this list. And another list is, let me show you, is another list for English learners is provided by Tara Benwell from English Club. She's an English teacher, and here she classifies books by age groups. You can see the age ranges here. You can also have a look at this list to choose the right books for your students. You can see the link below. And let's go on with poetry. Let's see how famous writers define poetry. Edgar Allan Poe says that poetry is the rhythmical creation of beauty in words. And as for Robert Frost, poetry is when emotion has found its thought and the thought has found words. Poems are usually written in a beautiful language, and they usually include figurative expressions like personification, metaphor, and symbolism. And while reading poems, students get familiar with metaphorical language use. In addition, rhythmic patterns, repetition of syllables and words in a poem can help students learn language structures better. Since they are usually short, poems are practical to use within class hours, and using a poem in a language class can engage students both emotionally and intellectually. On the right, you see an extract of a poem from William Wordsworth, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. There is also a song version of this poem performed by Pete Lashley. Please listen and sing, okay? Please let me know if there's a problem with the sound. Can you hear? Sorry.
I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd of golden daffodils beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending line along the margin of the bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance.
It's very beautiful, isn't it? When teaching poetry, it will be more effective to use song versions of poems if available, if you can find. And sorry, on the poetry Soup website, you can find many examples of poems. And another website is the Poet Zone. You can find many examples of poems here for young learners and teenagers, okay? You can see the link below. And let's go on with drama. As we all know, drama refers to play designed for performance, and drama-based activities like role plays can be an important part of communicative language syllabus, as students can turn knowledge into action by acting out stories, right? And they can encourage learners to talk in front of their peers. They address different learning styles like auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. And through drama, students can use English actively as they perform various roles, and they can learn appropriate language use in specific contexts. They can see the difference between formal and informal language use and direct and indirect meaning, and they can learn to use their body language effectively. Okay, this is BBC Learning English website, and on this website you can reach a wide variety of dramas. It also provides downloadable PDFs and audio files. Here you can see the link. And here you can also find examples of Shakespeare's works, such as The Merchant of Venice, Romeo and Juliet, and each episode includes popular modern English expressions and phrases used in Shakespeare's work, and you can also learn about his life and time. You can find the link below. Okay, let's continue with the teaching process and reading stages. Teachers must be well prepared to teach literature successfully. In this process, as Lazar suggests, we need to follow some stages like pre-reading, while reading, and post-reading. For example, for a short story, what can we do at these stages? Let's look at them one by one. Pre-reading stage. Pre-reading activities are useful and necessary to prepare learners for the reading. And at this stage, you can help students with cultural background. Sometimes it may be necessary to give information about cultural background and authors, to get students more involved in the text. For instance, an author's life experiences might have shaped their work, or their life experiences may be reflected in their work. So learning something about the author's life and time can facilitate students' understanding of the text. And stimulating student interest in the story. Before reading a new text, it is necessary to activate students' prior knowledge and draw their attention to the text. There are many ways to do this. For example, we can use the cover of the book or pictures in it, or the title of the text, and ask students to make predictions about the content of the text. This can stimulate students' interest in the target text. And for teaching vocabulary, it is very important to teach keywords, okay? Keywords in the target text before starting reading. This helps students to complete the reading task successfully. And while reading stage, the main purpose of this stage is to help students understand the text better. And here, the first goal is helping students to understand the plot. At this stage, we try to see whether students understood the main subject, the gist of the story. And example of activities for students are writing a brief summary of the plot, or writing titles for each paragraph. And the next one is helping students to understand the characters. We can give students a list of adjectives and then Ask them to choose the most appropriate adjectives for describing each character in the text. And next one is helping students with difficult vocabulary. Here, students can be given vocabulary quizzes and vocabulary comprehension questions. And the last one is helping students with silent language. Students, at this phase, we can use a part of the text to focus on as a particular grammar structure. For instance, we can blank out, we can remove verbs in a section of the text and ask students provide correct tenses. And the next stage is post-reading stage. In this part, students critically analyze the target text and understand it further. The first aim is helping students to make interpretations of the text. We can give students discussion questions that lead them to make interpretations about the text. We can have students underline lexical expressions which might be the sign of symbolic meaning in the story. For instance, white color can symbolize something that is good and pure in the story, okay? In the story they read. And understanding narrative point of view, we can have students write a letter describing the events in the text as if they were one of the characters in the text. And follow-up writing activities, students can write review of the story. And the last one is follow-up fluency practice. This part can include activities like role-playing a scene from the story, discussing the subject matter of a text by linking it to their own experiences. Here you see the English Post website. This website offers a wide variety of pre, while, and post-reading activities. They are not specifically designed for literary text, but you can adapt, you can make minor changes if necessary, and you can use them in your literature classes. Okay, and finally, how to choose literary text. There are some important factors, criteria to consider when choosing a literary text. The first one is interest, needs of learners. When choosing literary text, it is of great importance to consider the interests and needs of students we teach. The content, the subject matter of the text should be motivating and interesting. For instance, students may prefer to read contemporary literature like movie novels rather than classic literature. We should consider their interests and needs. And the next item is related to the length of the text, and literary text should be appropriate in terms of length. We need to consider questions like how long is the text? How much class time does it take to finish, to work on the text? Because some novels may be too long, and so students can have difficulty keeping up with them. And the next item is language level of the text. We need to check the language level of the text in terms of grammar, sentence structure, and vocabulary. If the language of the text is too difficult or too easy for students, they may lose their motivation to continue reading. And age of learners, the text needs to be appropriate for the age of students you teach. For example, literary texts which contain old expressions and complex themes such as politics, class system in a society will not be suitable for young learners. And you can ask yourself this question: are my students intellectually and emotionally mature enough to cope with the target text? And finally, cultural issues. The text we will use should also be culturally appropriate. We can consider questions like, is this text written in a way that respects values of other societies? Is it culturally offensive? How much cultural background information do students need to understand the text better? or to what extent are students familiar with the cultural concepts in the text, like that. And these are important factors to consider when choosing literary text. Now, I have come to the end of my presentation. Here is the list of references. If you would like more information, you can also have a look at them. That's all I have to say about this topic. Thank you for listening. If you need any further information about this topic after this webinar, you can also find my contact information below. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening.
And thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Thank you. And I think if our participants enjoy it much as well, we can see it from the Q&A session. But as I said before, there will be a bigger Q&A session after the second presentation. So meanwhile, I just want to make a short announcement before we start the second webinar, as there are lots of questions in the chat box about our social media accounts and the previous webinars. So you can follow the latest news about the project from our social media accounts, the Telegram, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook pages. Maybe, Hatice Hocam, you can just stop sharing and then, yes. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
And there will be new updates on our social media accounts, so feel free to follow and ask your questions via our social media accounts. I think now, can we share the information? Any information that will there be any background? Yeah. So thank you. So now it is time for the second webinar. Our second speaker today, it is Dr. Shannon Sauro. So I would like to introduce her before we start. Shannon Sauro is an associate professor in technologically mediated language teaching and learning and second language literacy in the Department of Education at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Her areas of research include the intersection of online fan practices and language learning and teaching, and the role of virtual exchange telecollaboration in language teacher education. She is editor of the books Call for Nobility with Joanna Ptura and the Handbook of Technology and Second Language Teaching and Learning with Carol Chappell, and the special issue of Language Learning and Technology with Katerina Sauro on Call in the Digital Vials. She sits on the editorial boards of the 3 flagship journals in the field of applied linguistics, Calico Journal, Language Learning and Technology, and TESOL Quarterly. As an international researcher, she was a member of 2 recently completed European funded projects, Science Fiction for the Teaching and Application of Languages through e-stories, and Evidence-Based Online Learning through Virtual Exchange, and currently serves as external expert for a 3rd project, Virtual Innovation and Support Networks for Teachers. She is a past president of the Computer Assisted Language Instruction Consortium, Calico, and is currently on the executive board of Unique Collaboration, an international organization for virtual exchange. So it is great pleasure to have you today, Dr. Sauro. The stage is yours.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to begin sharing screen now. And although that introduction was probably rather lengthy, you're going to hear about some of those projects that were mentioned when I talk today about fan fiction. And in particular, my title, Adventures in Fan Fiction for English Language Teaching and Learning, has inspired me to identify a few of those adventures that have come out of those projects in international spaces. And I think what's really delightful is having followed Dr. Okyar's talk, who explored some of the research that shows the learning that comes out of the use of literary texts in the classroom for language learning and teaching. I'm going to take us more in detail where we look at the student side and what happens and what the students have to say. So to begin, I want to provide a little bit of background. So at the start of our adventure, we're going to go into a space called the digital wilds. And that is defined here as the digital spaces, communities, and networks where language learning occurs that are independent of formal instructional context. Many of us have probably encountered some of the digital wilds, and maybe for ourselves, we've also done a bit of research or our own language learning in these spaces. I know some of our colleagues here have done research, for instance, on people using Twitter for language learning, just for fun. So that's an example of language learning in the digital wilds. But I'm particularly interested, and my source of inspiration comes from a certain area within these digital spaces called online fandom. And these are the local and international networks of fans that develop around a particular program, text, or other media product. And kind of in keeping with the flyer for today, we can see on the right a photo taken of fans who were attending or viewing the filming several years ago of the BBC Sherlocked television series. But we see these fans in these online spaces coming together and doing a lot of creative things beyond just talking about the thing that they like. And some of that leads to actual language learning. And that serves as an inspiration for the research that I'm going to share today. But I want to talk a little bit more about who these people are, because sometimes people will say to me, well, I watch this TV show, I read this book, am I a fan? And I want to say I'm taking the definition of fan from the field of fan studies. So that's a sub area of media studies that looks at responses to media. And I like this particular definition where they say, a fan is a person with a relatively deep, positive emotional conviction about someone or something famous. And I have a photo here of a relatively famous performer that served as a source of inspiration for some of my students this semester, who went on to do what I'm going to talk about, write fan fiction. But what I want to say is it's possible to be a fan of many things. We are familiar perhaps with sports fans. You have people who are fans of politicians. And today what I'm going to talk about in particular are fans of texts, media texts of different forms. So the stories that happen in books, movies, television shows, and a few other places that might be surprisingly rich in storytelling. But one of the things these fans do in the digital wilds is write what's known as fan fiction. And the definition that I have here is a nice broad one that says fan fiction is writing that continues, interrupts, reimagines, or just riffs on stories and characters other people have already written about. So you'll find communities online where fans of Harry Potter, for instance, have rewritten the ending if they didn't like it, or they've taken a minor character and explored their background. You'll find fans who have merged different texts. They've written stories where they put, for instance, the Sherlock Holmes character into the Harry Potter universe to find out what would happen if they were magical or something like that. So there are a lot of creative things that emerge in fan fiction. And to acknowledge, I myself am a fan, and I've come across people who've used fan fiction for the purpose of improving their own English skills. So that served as inspiration for what I'm calling the first quest, or the quest that underlies this adventure. Several years ago, I thought, well, I see these people doing fan fiction in such a way that their literacy in the language that they're learning really explodes and develops. How can we develop and assess fan fiction activities like that actually facilitate language learning, but also fit within formal educational contexts? And so this is where we go off on my first adventure, which took place in Sweden, where I worked with a colleague to try and bring fan fiction to a university level English classroom. Now, this is a class that is required for university English teachers, so people who are training to be English teachers, much like I think many of you here are as well. And this is a required course that is taken by students in their first semester, and it's on teaching literature and creative writing for lower secondary and upper secondary school students at Malmö University in Sweden. It's a really large class. We would often see between 80 to 100 students. And what we were looking at is there a way we can take and fit a fan fiction activity into this course? And so this became a project that took place over a 6-year period as we tried to work to integrate it into the class. And because of the class size, it was collaborative fan fiction writing. And over the years, we used a different source or literary text. The first 2 years of the project, we used Tolkien's The Hobbit. We called this project The Blogging Hobbit. We revised the project based on feedback and other things that we learned along the way, and we brought in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And so the next 2 years, the students who took that course wrote fan fiction based on Sherlock Holmes, and we called it A Study in Sherlock. And then based on popular demand, because we had so many young people who grew up reading the Harry Potter books, that we ended up spending the final 2 years with them writing fan fiction based on Harry Potter, which we called the Potter Project. So I'm going to talk a little here about what the assignments were, what we had them do, and then I'm going to share student reflections on their actual learning that they experienced at the level. So as you recall, this is a high level, we would say high intermediate to low beginner, we might say that the B2 to C1 level on the Common European Framework of Reference. Now, an acknowledgement, the instructors included not only me, who I acknowledge I'm a fan. I'm a fan of Sherlock Holmes and Harry Potter, among other things, an avid reader of fan fiction. But my colleague, who you can also see here, Björnsson Mark, is a professor of English literature. He was the editor of the journal Barnböcken, which is a text for children's literature in Sweden. And he's a big fan of Lord of the Rings. He even has a dog named Gimli, a character from that series. So we brought our own enthusiasm to the class when we developed these assignments. Now, as for the students, I'm often asked, well, were they fans? And I want to say each year it depended. In every class, we had some people who strongly identified as a fan, sometimes of the thing that we were actually reading, sometimes as other things. So we see this, an example, one student one year that I identify as a fan, like since the beginning of time. She was an avid fan of many things. But we also had students at the other end of the spectrum who really were not super excited about what we were having them read. So one student said, to be frank, this was a universe I cared absolutely nothing about, so I didn't have any investment from the start. So I want you to keep that in mind, that this is also the feedback that we get is a reflection of students' initial interest in the text and how it may have changed over time as a result of this project, or maybe it didn't. But altogether, what we had students do in their collaborative groups is they would write a collaborative piece of fan fiction, and they were in groups of about 3 to 6 students. And because of their level, we said, you each need to contribute 1,000 words to your fan fiction. So we would have stories that ranged in length from, on the low end, 3,000 words. And we had one group of super enthusiastic students, not all of whom were fans. They actually wrote a 16,000 word story. So this project ran over about a 8-week period. And so that's what they generated. In addition to the collaborative fan fiction that they wrote, each student wrote an individual reflection paper asking them to think about and explore both the linguistic features and the literary devices that they paid attention to in their fan fiction. So this was a way of both facilitating their awareness of learning, making them reflect on their choices, but it also helped us see and document what kind of learning resulted from this project for this type of student. And so what I'm going to share in particular comes from those individual reflection papers. What we saw across all 6 years was a common reference to vocabulary development, but the kind of vocabulary students recognized developing often depended on the source text. So here I have a quote from a student who took part in the initial years where they read Tolkien's The Hobbit. And those of you are probably very familiar with it, but it is a fantasy text. So the language itself doesn't reflect common everyday language. And the students in Sweden, although they have, we might say, very high oral proficiency in English, the kind of English they use is much more modern, youthful, and not at all fantasy-based. So what a lot of students observed was having to write in the style of this initial text of The Hobbit, that this influenced their language skills. And this student said, during the project, I've been able to expand my repertoire of English words, which are not so commonly used in everyday English anymore. And students gave examples. For instance, one group wrote a story in which there was meant to be a kind of party celebrating the arrival of the characters in a location. And they realized they couldn't simply say, oh, we threw a party and there were snacks and drinks and stuff, because those words didn't fit into that fantasy realm. So they had to read through the text very carefully to see what words would be better. So instead of party, they would say there was a feast. And you can see feast is not usually a common everyday word that we use regularly. So that's just an example of how that close reading of the text influenced the kind of vocabulary. We also had students who were very aware through their fan fiction writing of the style that the initial writer used, and they tried to mimic that in their writing. And that manifested in a very careful attention to what we might see language form or morphosyntax. So this was the case with a student who took part in the middle 2 years that read the stories, the Sherlock Holmes stories, which we know were written about 100 years ago. So represent an older type of language, kind of a more Victorian English. And these students tried to copy the style of that text. And one said, instead of saying he said, we and Doyle, the author, instead said he. So we can see an inversion here. Second, we and Doyle, often from Watson's perspective, referred to Sherlock Holmes as my colleague, and from Sherlock's perspective, referring to Watson as my friend. Doyle's Sherlock Holmes often said pray instead of please, and I fancy instead of I believe, which we also used in our fan fiction. So again, this manifested in very different phrasings that they became aware of because they tried to mimic it in the text that they were writing. And this is also mirroring what another student identified as well, is adapting their own language to fit the language of the time. So one student observed, again, dealing with the Sherlock Holmes text, the first thing that came to mind for me when considering Arthur Conan Doyle's language and how to emulate it was the time it was written in. The problem when writing the fan fiction was knowing which words were and which were not used in Arthur Conan Doyle's time. Thankfully, we have the internet now, and whenever my group was in doubt, we could find the answer quite easily. So what we're seeing here is a kind of research that students are engaging in to look at shifting in language over time. So this is a very sociolinguistic concept, an awareness of different varieties of English, but also historical varieties of English that may not be exactly what they are familiar with now. So again, another kind of vocabulary development that is clearly a reflection of the specific text that they were reading and writing about. Now, when we move to Harry Potter, which is a more contemporary text, and it's also a text that uses a lot of magical words that the author has created, often from Latin and Greek, we would assume maybe there wasn't the same degree of attention to vocabulary. But what we did see is something really interesting that had never happened previously. And that was the students started attending to features of writing that built on their prior training in academic writing. So prior to this class, they had completed a course on academic writing where they were learning how to write essays using longer sentences and transition words and different kinds of punctuation. And this particular group of students noticed when they started reading the Harry Potter text, especially when they were trying to write dialogue or longer sentences, is the author, Rowling, doesn't use punctuation the same way that they would use it normally in other texts. So this student said, this project made me pay attention to grammatical aspects in the Harry Potter books. For example, Rowling doesn't use a lot of transitional words, which we just used a lot in academic writing, but rather she uses colons, those two dots. I've never used colons before in my writing, so that was fun to learn. So that's a very interesting attention to punctuation form as students were trying to emulate the style of Rowling in their fan fiction. But what's also interesting is how much this also affected students beyond just what they did in class, but having an impact on their everyday language use and their awareness of their language use. So one student started to reflect on her own language use. She said, well, I realized that when I was writing the conversation bits of the story, I kept thinking to myself, can you say that? Or do people really talk like this? Which really made me reflect on my own ways of speaking and how I present myself in different types of conversations. So here we see an example of language awareness emerging and an awareness of appropriacy, another sociolinguistic context, appropriacy of how she expresses herself in speaking that she became aware of when she started writing dialogue as part of the fan fiction. Now, another thing that happened, I want to point out, because not everything was perfect and wonderful, but there were some growth areas that we saw in students who initially really weren't happy about the fan fiction they were writing because they didn't know the text or they may have struggled with it. So this goes back to those who were not fans. We had an interesting group one year who, again, were reading the Sherlock Holmes stories, an older story, and they didn't connect to them the same way, but they were allowed through their fan fiction to do what's known as fusion, where you can fuse the story, here in the case of the Sherlock Holmes stories, with another set of texts that they know and like. And this one group wrote fusion that merged Sherlock Holmes with the American television or cartoon series Scooby-Doo. It's a mystery series. Many of you may be familiar with it. It's situated in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So the language is very of that time and very different from what Holmes and Watson would be saying in the Victorian period. And these students thought, well, both deal with mysteries. What if we merge them together, and what happened? And that really inspired a lot of creativity and increased their interest in reading the Sherlock Holmes stories because they were allowed to connect it with something they were already passionate about. So one student said, my interest in Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes world is still at an intermediate level. On the other hand, my knowledge of the Scooby-Doo universe is far greater, and I could enter that verse much easier than the universe of Sherlock Holmes. So that inspired like kind of this deeper engagement by allowing them to bring in a thing in addition to the required reading, to bring it into the course and have a little bit of fun with their fan fiction. But I do also want to conclude that not everything was perfect, and there were still challenges that we faced on the way that we wanted to address. And sometimes the source text itself really alienated our students. And this came up particularly the first 2 years when we did the project. And it's encapsulated by this quote from a student who talks about how she struggled to really get into The Hobbit. She said, I felt it unfair to work with The Hobbit on such a project, since a big part was to connect with a character from the book and write from that perspective. To choose a book with absolutely no women at all made me not wanting to take neither Tolkien nor this assignment to heart. So that was a fair criticism in the initial stages of this fan fiction project. We selected a text that, you know, was age appropriate for the groups of learners they would be working with, was something we knew well and we had fans of in the class. But it's also well known as a text that kind of doesn't have much to do with women, and the characters were harder for the students to relate to. And that led us to changing the text over time and changing the approach. But it also leads me to another adventure, because what happens here is we required a text that we as the teachers said, you're going to read, but there are other approaches to incorporating fan fiction in the classroom. And now I'm going to take us to another classroom where we did just that. And we explored what happens when you bring these fan fiction tasks into a slightly lower level classroom, into the secondary school level. And for this, we travel to Belgium. So we go a little bit south of Sweden and head to the town of Aalst, which you can see here on the map, not too far outside of Brussels on the left. And in this next adventure, we're in a secondary school classroom of upper secondary school learners who are in their final year. So they're 17 to 18, so slightly younger than the ones that we had in Sweden, who at this point, they were in their early 20s. And they're at a slightly lower level of English, we would say at the B2 level. And it was a smaller class, only 21 students, who were also organized into collaborative writing groups. But this time, the source text is a little different. So I know today's theme, we've been talking about bringing literature into our teaching, but I also want to point out that there are many stories that can influence learning, but they come from a variety of different media types, and they can also inspire fan fiction. And in this particular case, we look to not a book, but a video game that has some degree of narrative elements. So these students had a multi-week assignment, approximately 25 classroom hours were dedicated to it, where they wrote collaborative, we would say interactive fan fiction. It's a specific type of fan fiction using the tool Twine, which allows you, it's an application that allows you to create your own online stories. And you'll see an example of what it looks like. But these stories have a choice. So as you write it, it's like those older choose your own adventure style stories where you get to a point in the book where it says, okay, now there's a door. Do you open the door or do you turn around and come back? And if you open the door, you go to page 16. If you turn around and go back, you move to page 48. And it leads to a very different experience. So the students were writing that kind of fan fiction, but they were basing it on the game Assassin's Creed, which is an action adventure video game with a narrative element. And it has multiple versions. Each version features a different time period and region where the stories take place. So in this case, the students voted as a class on what the source text would be. And they decided we want to do Assassin's Creed because of its flexibility, and it was something a lot of them were familiar with. And they were allowed to bring in other texts that they knew, much like the Scooby-Doo group that we saw previously, to merge it with Assassin's Creed and kind of increase their interest. So here's an example of one of those stories, or a portion of it that it was produced. This is from a story called Shallow Waters, and it incorporated the setting of Assassin's Creed Black Flag, which is a pirate-based story. And many of them also were really interested in the idea of female pirates. So they did a lot of research on actual women pirates and tried to bring them into that story. And so we can see an example here. The white text is the story as it's happening. Mary Hathaway still didn't realize, etc. Then you get down to the blue text, where she's faced with a dilemma. What should she do? Attack them or turn the ship around? And that's where the stories diverge. So they would write it in these different parts with branching narratives. And that was the kind of fan fiction that they generated. So quite a bit different from what we had students doing in Sweden. And here is what the students identified as having learned from the project. Many of them pointed to the fact that it improved their overall writing skills. So one said, it improved our writing skills because first, we never wrote such an extensive text, and now we did. And we did it descriptive, so it improved our writing skills. And I want to point out that comment about description came up a lot also when we hear them discussing vocabulary. That was a key thing as well. But the vocabulary these students identified was a little different from what we saw at the university level, in part because of their level. Another thing that was identified was the overarching development of kind of sentence structure, because what they were writing was a text that was creative. So I have this slide defined as building beautiful sentences that you want to read. And one student said, I think that with the English, we had to pay attention to the structure of the sentences, because it was very tempting to start every sentence with he did this, he did that, and then continue that, or to just make very short sentences instead of trying to build a decent, beautiful sentence that you would actually read in a book. In other words, the students realized that when they were writing fan fiction, and especially sharing it with their classmates, they needed to write something that was actually interesting to read. And they recognized that varying the sentence structure helped with readability and gaining interest and making a text more beautiful and like you actually wanted to read it. So this was an interesting experience because the kind of writing that they had done previously was not creative. And so if they didn't have the same variation in their sentences, if they had the common, basically the same sentence structure, it didn't matter as much because they never felt the text was intended to be interesting. Here, they were invested in making their text interesting. And that also included selecting words that were interesting. So this is where we go back to that idea of descriptive. The students recognized they had to learn a lot more adjectives and adverbs to build the universe that they were describing, because suddenly they realized those reading their stories needed to be able to imagine. And so they found themselves using words that they would not normally have used in the kind of writing they had been using in school up until that point. So I want to bring this together that from these two projects, there were lessons that I would say emerged out of this. And these are kind of the points going forward that I try to introduce to my own students when I'm training them as future English teachers who are interested in bringing fan fiction into the classroom. So first, look at what fans do, what they actually do online, and allow students to merge their interests with the assigned text. And this is that idea of fusion or crossover. Next, I'm just giving here the very big projects outcomes, but what we've learned is that it's necessary to scaffold the larger projects within class fan fiction writing, so short writing, to inspire confidence and creativity. Often there are a lot of people who, even at the advanced levels, have not written creative texts in English and doubt themselves. So giving them that opportunity to do so on a smaller scale in class is really necessary. Another thing we found really beneficial is that having students write in small groups can help self-conscious creative writers. Many students identified the fact that having a classmate who could give them feedback, or that they would work together, or if one of the students was more comfortable with creative writing and could set the tone and start it, that helped the other students who were less certain of their abilities to write creatively. We also found it really valuable to incorporate classroom teaching activities to support both linguistic and literary knowledge. So it's not enough to just tell our students, what literary choices did you make? But also, this is where we bring in a degree of literary analysis, helping them to know the vocabulary and understand what literary techniques are being used in the stories that they know and read, and recognizing which are the ones that they're incorporating into their own. So building their knowledge of literature and literary analysis, as well as linguistic concepts. And finally, and this was a challenging part, it's hard sometimes when you think, how do you assess these things? But we found, again, assessment should recognize both the innovation that, students are being creative and coming up with something new, but also still connecting it to that source text and demonstrating an understanding. They're not writing something wholly new. It needs to demonstrate that they read, processed, and engaged with this source text. And I want to say that these ideas were behind one of the projects that I was a part of recently called Fan Tales. And so we created a lot of teaching materials, and this classroom in Belgium was one of our, we might say, test sites where we experimented with teaching materials and assessment materials. But Fan Tales, and you can see them at the link here below, they've produced, if you're interested yourself in trying to explore bringing fan fiction into your classroom, Fan Tales created a bunch of storytelling prompts and rubrics. And now the project was available in multiple languages, so you could see it for the teaching of English, German, Dutch, and Swedish. We also produced a teacher handbook that includes sample lessons, detailed guidance on how to implement fan fiction and other types of interactive fiction, and materials for different language learners and learner populations. And we've also developed an interactive online platform. So all this is free to use. If you're curious and you're thinking, hey, I want to start with something like that, I think this is a good place to look. And we also provide some self-training modules for teachers who maybe want to learn more about fan fiction. And I also want to, as I move to my conclusion, if you're interested in the further adventures of teaching with fan fiction, you'll see some of the slides here today. I cited a recent publication I had with Steve Thorne, where we described that 6-year project and some of the pitfalls we faced, but how we responded to student feedback and adapted that project over time so that it was actually not just more interesting for the students, but probably really got into the kind of activities that you find in online fan spaces, and so more successfully integrating the digital wilds back into the language classroom. And I want to conclude briefly with a fan art acknowledgement. Some of the pictures that you saw illustrating the slides today were generously donated by a fellow fan artist named Fox Estacado to illustrate some of the fan fiction and the ideas. And these are the references. And I believe the PowerPoint slides will be made available after this talk. So you can feel free to look up if any of these things seemed relevant. And so that's my talk. Thank you for listening.
And sorry, yeah. Thank you very much for such an inspiring presentation and sharing your experiences with us tonight, Dr. Sauro. So now I would just want to move to Q&A session quickly, and maybe we can just ask our participants to write in the chat box about what are they fan of, their favorite book or their favorite film series, And now, yes, I would like to start with the first question. It's about like having prejudices against the context belonging to the other nations, like especially American and British, if they are presented dominantly. So like when it is something that we are trying to avoid for like cultural awareness, what would you suggest to minimize this occurrence? If some students have some prejudice against context belonging to other nations. So I think, yes, this could be a question for Dr. Okyar. Maybe
Okay.
then, yes, if you want to add something, Dr. Zora, feel free. Yes.
Okay. First, as a teacher, we can help learners understand that there are many different cultures and we should approach them with empathy and tolerance. The main aim here is to understand the story, understand the content, right? We shouldn't focus on nations or countries. We should focus on the story of the literary text. And we can help learners recognize, see cultural diversity.
Yes, true. Do you want to add something, or shall we move to the other question? Yes.
I can add something. This is something that I've been challenged with here when I brought fan fiction to the United States, because it may not be exactly like, it's exactly like Dr. Okyar is saying. It's not always about country. It could be community or culture or dominant culture, and how important it is with the selection of text that we think about what is it we're bringing into the classroom, what we're representing, and of course, maybe allowing, depending on your learner population, a chance to see different groups or even themselves reflected in the stories that they're reading. So this is where I think allowing students to merge other texts with others that you assign is a way to invite that conversation.
Yeah, true. And tonight we have like nearly 250 participants. There are a lot of thank you messages going on in the chat box. And I would like to move to the second question. Somebody asked about the rubrics, like assessment and evaluation. I think you shared it already, and someone from the team shared it in the chat box, the link about your project, Dr. Zora. So do you want to add something about it? Like, yeah.
Exactly. The Fantails website has specific documents that are assessment tools for fan fiction that we developed with teachers. So it's kind of allowing teachers to pick and choose those that are relevant. So we've come up with a checklist, a detailed rubric, but also a peer assessment tool. So if you go to the website, you can download that in English and adapt that.
Thank you. And moving to the next one. It's about novels, and in fact we have novels that are too realistic, like in autobiographical novels. Don't you think that it is like, yeah, important, or what do you think about this? Too realistic, yeah, about the novels. Yeah, Dr.
Yes.
Okyar, yeah.
Okay, because of time constraints, I couldn't get into detail. Of course, there are many different types of literary text, and autobiographical fiction is one of them, and they are based on the real life events of the author, and that's to say their life is an inspiration for their writing. We can also use them in our classes. Why not? Since they are from real life, they will be more interesting, more motivating for students.
Yes, thank you. And the next question might be relevant to both of you. And it asked about like this type of this teaching technique is student-centered or not? What do you think? Yes. Is it student-centered, or what are your experiences about it? Yes, so if you want, Dr. Zora, we can start with you.
Okay, so I think that is exactly one of the things that we struggled with when we started bringing fan fiction in. It was not student-centered enough. It was more the teacher saying, you have one way to write, you have to do this, you have to stay very close to the text. And what we recognized is as we gave the students more choices so they could bring in their interests and connect it to their passions, then it got actually better. It was more successful. So it was a lesson learned over time.
Mhm. That's true. Do you want to add something, Dr. Okyar?
Sorry, I
Uh,
couldn't understand.
Do you want to add anything about these questions? Like, do you think that this type of teaching is student-centered or not?
I want to say something about the teaching process, as I mentioned before, like pre-teaching, while teaching, and post-reading stages. We should put students into the in center of these processes, right? And during, before reading and while reading, and after reading, they are active in the process. For instance, at post-reading stage, they can take different roles by playing role plays, right? And they are in the center, and they can read a poem aloud by using their gestures, mimics. We can help them to be active learners during this process.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And there are actually two questions, and which will be relevant to maybe like to all participants here with us tonight. Short stories for young adults, or again, stories which can be used for secondary schools. Do you have any like recommendation about that? Dr. Zora, I can see you nodding, so do you want to start?
So I'm going to talk about the Fan Tales group again, because we're talking about fan fiction. And what we wanted to do was find out what are young people currently interested in. It changes over time. And so sometimes there are really great classical texts that you can bring in, but other times it's nice to bring in contemporary ones. So we actually created a survey, and there are example surveys that we use to give to young people to find out what are you reading or what do you want to read in English, and using that to see which of these seem reasonable as a classroom text. And that's been helpful.
Okay. Thank you very much. And the last question is like how to deal with the students who are like unwilling to participate, like for this kind of like teaching method. So do you want to start, Dr. Okyar? Do you have any suggestions for the teachers to deal with the students who are unwilling to participate?
In order to motivate students, we can use different kinds of tools. We can get help from technology, right? We can use videos, we can use film clips, we can use audio recordings. We should integrate audio-visual materials in our classes to make them more motivated, right? Multimodal, we can also use multimodal tools to help them be more motivated.
Yes, true. Thank you very much. Dr. Zara, do you want to add anything?
I would like to give an example of something that happened with a colleague of mine who was teaching lower secondary school learners. And she found they had to watch movies in their class and then write in response to them. And every year there were certain children who didn't really like the movie. So let's say they had to watch the Titanic, right? Because that was like kind of tied to the history lesson. And there were a group of boys who were like, oh, I don't like this romance stuff. And so they were not very excited about it. What she did is she brought in fan fiction, and she said things like, okay, you get to pick one of the movies that we have to watch in class, and you can write fan fiction about it based on something else that you like. And so there was this group of boys who went, okay, they like Batman. So they wrote a story imagining if Bruce Wayne, Batman's parents, who were wealthy, had died on the Titanic, because they thought this makes sense. They could go back and let's say they died on the Titanic, and they got so excited. They wrote the story and they're like, oh, you know, this will explain why Batman is so depressed all the time. And it made them really care about the historical side of the Titanic, less about the romance, but they really got into it because they got to talk about Batman. So that worked.
Yeah, well, Actually, it's a great example. I think as a teacher, we need to sometimes know our students better, like what they will like, and yeah, to motivate them a bit more. So I think this is the end of our webinar tonight. Thank you very much, Dr. Zora and Dr. Okyar, for being with us and for your great presentations. And thank you to our participants. On behalf of the VIP Learning Network team, I would like to thank everyone and wish you a happy new year in advance, and hope to see you all in the next year with the upcoming webinars. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone.
Goodbye.